Western games. They've been dreadful in recent years, haven't they? On the internet, we do love a bit of pattern recognition, don't we? And for anyone even paying a small modicum of attention, you would likely have noticed the waves upon waves of videos uploaded criticising the so-called poor state of Western AAA gaming, often contrasted sharply against the consistently decent offerings put out by the East. Scroll through the comments under any rant about live service nonsense or soulless corporate game design, and you'll inevitably find someone wistfully saying, at least Japan still cares about making actual games. In fact, last year, South Korea and even China received a great deal of praise online for bringing Stellar Blade and Black Myth Wukong into the world, with many framing the entire Western gaming hemisphere as failing on all levels. The West sucks, right? It's a place where games like Concord, Suicide Squad and Dragon Age the Veilguard are born. In my view, these criticisms are gross oversimplification. The majority of the industry's problems can be traced back to a single source: the United States. The issue isn't with Western gaming as a whole, it's with American gaming specifically, where corporate bloat, creative stagnation and a fixation on live service models have become the norm. Europe, in contrast, has delivered most of the West's standout releases in recent years, and when things do fall apart, it's usually because of American interference and influence, whether that be direct or indirect. I am Lady Decade. Hit that subscribe button, as this is how one country's corporate overreach and bizarre culture war have given the whole of Western gaming a bad name. Expedition 33. When I'm not playing it, I'm thinking about it, and when I am playing it, I'm wondering how the hell this thing even exists in 2025 without being smothered in microtransactions, bad haircuts, moral lectures, and spoon-fed, uninspired mechanics designed for only the most basic of idiots to get the most out of. Essentially, this game is everything many of its contemporaries are not. And what's better is you can grab it right now using my discount link to get a ludicrous 40% off. Or, if a newly released fighting game is your thing, how about 30% off the amazing Fatal Fury City of the Wolves? Get up to 90% off of thousands of modern AAA classic and retro titles too. Happy shopping, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this video. When the internet laments the decline of Western gaming, the criticism, whether consciously or not, tends to centre on the United States. This isn't just anecdotal. Over the last several years, some of the most high-profile failures in the industry have stemmed from American studios, or at the very least, from studios operating under American corporate leadership or shareholder influence. Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League is one such case. Developed by Rocksteady and published by Warner Bros. Discovery, the game shifted towards a live service model, reportedly at the behest of corporate strategy rather than developer intent. Reception was overwhelmingly negative and the player base dropped off almost immediately. Anthem from BioWare also became emblematic of this broader issue. Developers struggled under EA's pressure to conform to a live service structure, even though there was no clear vision for the gameplay itself. Multiple delays, managerial missteps, and a last-minute shift in direction led to a game that launched unfinished, confused, and poorly received. In fact, support was later dropped entirely. And then there are, of course, examples like Dragon Age the Veilguard, a franchise once known for layered storytelling and complex world building, now reduced to controversy and confusion. The game's trailers and pre-release materials were met with near-universal criticism, with many long-term fans disappointed that the franchise's tone had shifted dramatically. Upon release, the game failed to resonate commercially or critically. Sales were weak, player engagement was low, and the feedback was far more negative than EA had anticipated. As a result, BioWare suffered significant layoffs, with numerous long-serving developers losing their positions after the game's poor performance. The situation ended up being a complete embarrassment for all involved. While BioWare is a Canadian studio, its direction has, of course, been steered by EA's American executive structure for well over a decade. From marketing tone to monetization strategy, Veilguard's development appears to have been shaped less by creative ambition and more by brand positioning, crafted to fit a content strategy rather than to serve fans of the series. These failures aren't isolated to creative missteps, they reflect a broader pattern, one driven by US corporate priorities, an obsession with monetization, shareholder value, and trend chasing that routinely interferes with the fundamentals of good game design. Arcane serves as a prime example of this. Known for critically acclaimed single-player titles like Dishonored and Deathloop, the studio's Austin branch, following its acquisition by ZeniMax and later Microsoft, was steered towards creating Redfall, a multiplayer co-op shooter. According to reports from Bloomberg and IGN, the team lacked interest in the project's direction, but management pushed ahead regardless. After a poorly received launch, Microsoft shuttered the studio in 2024, along with several others. The failure wasn't down to incompetence, but a fundamental misalignment between creative intent and corporate mandate. CD Projekt Red offers a more gradual case. After the success of The Witcher 3, a game developed entirely under their own vision, using in-house tools and grounded in Polish storytelling traditions, the studio began expanding internationally. They opened a Boston office, adopted more standardized workflows, and shifted communications to align with American marketing norms. The contrast became stark with Cyberpunk 2077, a title plagued by delays, crunch, and inflated expectations. While the game has since improved post-launch, the initial backlash was severe. In 2023, CDPR laid off over 100 employees in a restructuring move that aimed to align more efficiently with industry standards, many of which mirror US development models. The difference between The Witcher 3 and Cyberpunk 2077 illustrates what can happen when a European studio adopts a more Americanized corporate structure. In both CDPR and Arcane's cases, the shift away from focused, narrative-driven experiences towards broader market-driven ambitions led to products that neither met expectations nor played to the studio's strengths. A depressing trend indeed. The lesson is consistent. When American corporate priorities, so monetization, scale, and brand alignment, are imposed on European developers, the results are rarely creatively successful. But these values don't need to come directly from the United States to cause harm. Sometimes, the damage is self-inflicted by studios that adopt the same logic in an attempt to compete on American terms. One of the clearest examples of corporate mismanagement mimicking the worst tendencies of American business culture is the case of Embracer Group. Behind the scenes, Embracer's financial model was built on unstable ground. Much of its projected revenue growth was tied to a mysterious $2 billion deal with a Saudi-backed fund, which ultimately fell through in 2023. When the funding collapsed, so did the strategy. Embracer began shuttering studios, cancelling games, and laying off hundreds of developers, many of whom had only recently been brought on board. THQ Nordic, once a beloved mid-tier publisher under Embracer's umbrella, saw its reputation gutted almost overnight. What's telling is that Embracer's failure didn't stem from a uniquely European problem. It was the result of copying the US tech industry's growth at all costs playbook, prioritizing acquisitions and investor confidence over sustainable creative output. In trying to compete with American giants like EA and Activision on their own terms, Embracer adopted the same financialization logic that had already undermined so much of the US games industry. The collapse not only damaged European development, but also fed into the broader perception that Western gaming is in crisis. But again, the problem wasn't a lack of creativity, it was the result of corporate overreach, driven by a global rush to emulate Silicon Valley's short-term thinking. And that influence doesn't stop with acquisitions or financial collapse. In many cases, it seeps in more quietly, reshaping how studios think, hire, and present themselves, even when they remain nominally independent. You see, the influence of US corporate culture doesn't stop at the American border, it extends into Europe, often reshaping studios that technically aren't American at all. Take Ubisoft, once known for distinctively European titles like Rayman or Beyond Good and Evil, the company has, over the past decade, increasingly adopted American publishing habits and cultural framing. From game structure to character writing, Ubisoft's recent output reflects many of the same priorities as their US counterparts: open-world bloat, monetization mechanics, and superficial diverse casting used as marketing shorthand. Internal reports and interviews have pointed to management being more concerned with hitting externally imposed DEI benchmarks than delivering innovative or challenging game concepts. These changes are often presented as progress, but they raise an important question. Is global creativity really thriving, or is it being funneled through a single ideological filter, one headquartered on the American West Coast? Some of the most recognisable names in gaming have seen their identities quietly rewritten to better align specifically with American cultural and commercial expectations, even when the games are being produced on different continents completely, often delivering some very questionable results. Sony has long been perceived as Japan's great gaming giant, but over the past decade, it too has undergone a shift. One that reflects the growing dominance of American corporate influence, even in companies not based in the United States. In 2016, Sony Interactive Entertainment officially relocated its operational headquarters to California. Under the leadership of Jim Ryan, Sony's creative marketing strategies began to reflect this change. Japanese developers were quietly moved out of key decision-making roles, with greater emphasis placed on cinematic storytelling, prestige-style presentation, and games designed to appeal to American audiences and media outlets. Studios like Naughty Dog and Sony Santa Monica came to represent the new PlayStation house style, highly polished, narrative-heavy action games that drew direct comparisons to Hollywood. Critics frequently praised these titles, but not all fans were convinced. Many longtime PlayStation supporters felt that the company's identity had been diluted, that it was less about gameplay diversity and innovation, and more about brand alignment with American media expectations. Since Jim Ryan's departure, however, there are signs that this shift may be slowing or even reversing. Hideaki Nishino, who now oversees Sony's platform experience, appears to be re-emphasizing the company's Japanese roots. New partnerships with Japanese studios, renewed support for hardware innovation in Japan, and a reorganization of development priorities all suggest a soft course correction. That influence doesn't just shape how games are made, increasingly it determines how they're marketed, communicated, and even timed. Especially when it comes to developers trying to appeal to American audiences. One of the less obvious but increasingly impactful ways American influence manifests in gaming is through marketing and PR. According to reporting from Nikkei Asia, several Japanese developers have begun delaying or reworking game announcements not because of technical readiness, but to avoid potential cultural backlash from loud, often obnoxious American audiences. The report highlights a growing trend. Japanese studios, particularly those of global ambitions, are advised by American PR firms to preemptively alter trailers, marketing language, and even character presentation to align with American socio-political norms. Developers have reportedly been told to avoid certain themes or imagery, not because they're controversial in Japan or Asia, but because they might cause offense on platforms like Blue Sky or Reddit. But I don't think it's at all fair to blame the average American player for this. This kind of gatekeeping isn't coming from fans, it's often driven by PR agencies, brand consultants, and marketing teams based in the US, who apply a uniform cultural filter across all regions. It's a soft form of censorship that reshapes how games are introduced to the world, often at odds with the developer's original intent. So when people speak about Western games having a certain tone or agenda, what they're often reacting to isn't a design philosophy, it's a communications pipeline dominated specifically by American priorities. Even Japanese games are being presented in ways designed to appease a very, very specific American cultural lens. After all, you wouldn't want to offend anyone, especially people from the richest and most privileged country on the planet. Above everyone else, it seems, they most need to be kept comfortable in their safe spaces. First world problems and all. But what's interesting is that not every country is following that path and towing the line. South Korea has taken a more cautious approach, one that reflects a growing awareness of the risks involved in becoming too entangled with American publishing norms. Recently, several Korean developers have begun distancing themselves from American publishing partnerships, not due to the lack of opportunity, but out of concern over the shifting priorities that often come attached. Internally, some Korean teams have expressed concern that working too closely with American firms could result in the same pressures faced by studios in the US and Europe. Korean studios tend to prioritize style, responsiveness to player feedback, and highly iterative design, often released first in domestic markets before expanding abroad. This cultural insulation is deliberate. While Korea is no stranger to monetization models or competitive development cycles, the studios there have largely resisted the creeping influence of American culture war dynamics. As one developer put it in industry commentary, "We want to make games people will enjoy, not statements they'll argue about." A refreshingly different take. In this sense, South Korea is another useful contrast. It shows that developers can identify the cultural baggage that sometimes comes with American publishing support and choose not to adopt it. But even when developers resist those pressures internally, the framing of their work can still be shaped externally, because it's not just publishers influencing how games are made, it's also how they're talked about. The games media plays a significant part in reinforcing the ideological filter applied to development and reception, particularly in the United States. In an interview conducted by IGN during the lead-up to Redfall's release, the developers were asked directly whether the game had been designed with DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion goals in mind. It's notable not just for the question itself, but for what it implies. That even a vampire co-op shooter made by a historically immersive sim studio is now expected to demonstrate ideological alignment as part of its public profile. The developers avoided giving a clear answer, but the exchange highlights how far removed games media has become from the average player's concerns. In a title already under scrutiny for its mechanical issues and a genre pivot, press discourse shifted instead towards political framing. This kind of questioning has become increasingly common, with media outlets placing more emphasis on a game's surface-level messaging, character diversity, representation, tone, than on its core mechanics or design innovation. In doing so, the industry's most visible commentators reinforce the idea that games are primarily vehicles for messaging rather than artistic or technical achievement. It's a dynamic largely driven by American cultural priorities, but it shapes how games are perceived globally, further muddying the waters when critics speak about Western gaming as if it's a single unified entity. And let's be clear, not all games from the West are tarnished. Sometimes a project comes along that doesn't fit the usual narrative. A game that, although it features an American license, was not produced in America. Marvel Rivals is one of the most revealing case studies in recent memory, not because it's politically explosive, but because it quietly exposes just how much ideological baggage American IPs now carry. Chinese studio NetEase developed the game under license from Marvel and takes a clear departure from the usual American design playbook. Characters are highly stylized, visually appealing, and strikingly expressive, without any of the usual blandness that tends to accompany ESG compliance frameworks. No battle passes, no washed out colour palettes, just bold design and a strong sense of fun. It feels like what American games used to look like before everyone got scared of making anything too charismatic, too sexy, or too sincere. And that's precisely what makes it interesting. For all its polish, Marvel Rivals wasn't left alone. During closed testing, players uncovered references in character dialogue to a fictional rebellion, one that bore a passing resemblance to real-world tensions in Hong Kong. The reaction was swift. American audiences accused the game of being politically compromised, while Chinese players were frustrated by the studio's decision to censor itself and issue an apology quickly, not to them, but to Marvel and its international licensing partners. So despite being a Chinese-developed game, Marvel Rivals was still caught in the gravitational pull of American sensibilities, and while its visual flair suggests what's possible when US corporate mandates don't shackle developers, the controversy shows how fragile that freedom becomes the moment the IP touches American media discourse. What's most telling is that Marvel Rivals has proven extremely popular since its reveal. The game's vibrant art style, appealing characters, and focus on mechanical clarity have struck a chord with players across regions. That alone debunks the idea that inclusive design must mean dull design. In reality, this is a rare case of a game aligning with what players actually want, because it was allowed, even briefly, to be built outside of the ideological filter of American risk management. While many American and American-influenced projects have struggled, several European studios have flourished, often by deliberately resisting the trends driving the US market. Their success suggests that the problem isn't Western gaming at all, it's how and where that gaming is managed, ideally away from the US. Larian Studios, based in Belgium, is a clear standout. Baldur's Gate 3 launched to universal acclaim in 2023, with praise directed at its depth, polish, and refusal to compromise on player agency. It had no battle pass, no season structure, and no live service model. Instead, Larian focused on building a complete premium game and released it as such. The studio maintained full creative control throughout development, working outside the typical publisher system and funding the game independently after negotiations with Wizards of the Coast. And the results speak for themselves. Over 10 million copies sold, multiple Game of the Year awards, and a strong word of mouth that continues to this very day. Most notably, the game succeeded without relying on the monetization structures that have become standard across the US market. Another example is Ninja Theory's Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. Developed on a modest budget in the UK, the game delivered a cinematic, emotionally resonant experience that received critical praise and sold over 1 million copies within a year. The game was self-funded and self-published, an approach that gave the team freedom to experiment with mature themes and a grounded narrative-driven focus. Similarly, games like A Plague Tale Requiem from Asobo Studio in France and Control from Remedy in Finland have earned acclaim for strong single-player storytelling and gameplay innovation. These titles came from studios operating outside the US live service model, with fewer layers of executive oversight and a clearer vision from the outset, and the results speak for themselves. All the more poignant is that these successes are not isolated. They show that when European developers retain autonomy without being redirected by American corporate mandates, they can create games that resonate deeply with players. What unites these studios isn't geography, but structure. They're not working under US publisher expectations, and they're not designing around monetization funnels or quarterly growth reports. They're simply making games. And every now and then, one of them creates something that feels like a revelation. Just when it felt like the Western RPG had collapsed under the weight of branding teams and market research, along came Expedition 33, not from Japan, not from Larian, and certainly not from one of the big American publishing houses, but from a modest independent team in Montpellier, France. Developed by Sandful Interactive, Expedition 33 is a turn-based RPG that immediately caught attention with its painterly art style, rich character design, and unabashed romanticism. The developers described it as having a French Belle Epoque flavour, rooted in their own country's artistic heritage rather than the latest Netflix animation pipeline. Visually and tonally, it feels like a game from another timeline, one where artists, not data analysts, make design choices. And that's no accident. This is a small team with a clear cultural identity and no bureaucratic baggage. Sandful CEO Guillaume Broche has been open about their approach, a tightly scoped project guided by a unified creative vision. In interviews, he said that the aim was to create a world that feels lived in and beautiful, not something designed around seasonal monetization or trend compliance. There's no battle pass, no Hollywood tone matching, and no need to posture. It's just a game. It's also very French. Not in a gimmicky, self-conscious way, but in the same way Final Fantasy is unmistakably Japanese. That's what gives it weight. When a team leans into what they know, their history, their culture, their creative instinct, they tend to make something with a stronger sense of place, something honest. And that's the key difference. One of the reasons so many Japanese games have felt traditionally very cohesive and resonant is because they're made by Japanese teams, through a Japanese lens. They're not built by a committee to meet a dozen contradictory global demands. They carry flavour, personality, national texture. Western teams are clearly very capable of the same. Expedition 33 proves that. But too often, American-led projects end up so sterilised by HR departments, legal oversight and marketing trends that they forget to reflect anything at all. And that's the tragedy. It's not just that American games are overproduced or risk-averse, it's that they have no clear cultural fingerprint. They're hyper-individualistic to the point of blandness. Everyone's allowed to say a line, but no one's allowed to speak for the group. And in the absence of a shared voice, what's often left is just noise. Something else worth noting briefly is that in the modern games industry, there's a growing trend of hiring people to represent or write about a culture they weren't actually raised in, as if heritage alone qualifies you as a cultural authority. But blood doesn't make you an expert. I'm part Tamil, for instance, but I wasn't brought up with Tamil language, customs or values. It would be absurd for a studio to hire me to consult on Tamil culture in a video game, and yet this kind of box ticking happens constantly. Someone who's 8 generations removed from Ireland isn't Irish, they're American. And when you start building your games around these flimsy ancestral claims rather than lived cultural knowledge, you don't get representation, you get caricature. But there are exceptions, games that manage to embrace cultural identity without losing creative edge. And few franchises demonstrate that better or more ironically than one of the most iconic American series of all time, Grand Theft Auto. Let's be honest, no discussion about the so-called decline of American gaming would be complete without mentioning Grand Theft Auto, arguably the most successful franchise ever produced outside Japan. But despite being set in a fictionalized American city dripping with US cultural references, GTA is not, and never was, a product of American game development. It was born in Dundee, Scotland. The Grand Theft Auto franchise is a British creation, with the early GTA games being developed by DMA Design, later renamed Rockstar North, and steered creatively by the Houser brothers Dan and Sam, both British. From GTA 3 through Vice City and San Andreas, the series carved out a niche as a razor-sharp satire of American excess. The games are filled with absurd parodies of the absurdities of US consumerism, their hollow media culture, cartoonish crime logic, and constant political hypocrisy. But it wasn't a bitter critique, it was biting and clever in that very British way, observational, ironic, and uncomfortably close to the bone. The fact that these games were developed in the UK mattered. They weren't glorifying the US, they were holding up a mirror. GTA was funny, vulgar, and politically incorrect, not because it was trying to offend, but because it was holding American cultural cliches at arm's length and poking fun at them with a stick. And this outsider lens was the secret to its brilliance. It worked time and time again, and GTA 5, released in 2013, became one of the most successful games of all time, both critically and commercially, but it also marked a turning point. As Rockstar's global expansion accelerated, creative control gradually shifted away from the UK-based Rockstar North and towards its US studios, and, of course, American corporate culture started creeping in. The satire, once precise and culturally aware, became broader, flatter, and safer. GTA Online was a financial juggernaut, but it transformed the series from a clever single-player parody of America into an American-style monetization platform, complete with shark cards, grinding, and seasonal live service fluff. The more successful GTA 5 became, the more control consolidated in New York and California, and the more pressure there was to keep the money machine going. Internal reports from former developers described the environment as becoming increasingly hostile, censored, and sensitive to social media backlash. Creative decisions now pass through layers of HR review, brand protection, and shareholder optics. For many, Dan Houser's departure in 2020 was the final nail. One of the last voices protecting the franchise's cultural identity was gone, and with him, much of what made GTA subversive and unpredictable. Since then, leaks and industry reports suggest that GTA 6 is being developed under far tighter political scrutiny. Characters are being updated to reflect contemporary values better. The tone is reportedly more grounded, responsible, and globally conscious. In other words, less funny, less risky, and far more American. It's telling that a once British series known for mocking American corporate culture now finds itself slowly consumed by it. GTA didn't become worse because of age or scale, it became worse because it's lost its outsider's voice. It stopped being British satire about America and started becoming American self-reflection, filtered through legal, marketing, and HR. And in doing so, for me and many others at least, it stopped being the GTA we knew and appreciated. But, to Rockstar's credit, in the modern era they weren't always in retreat. Before that final shift, the studio delivered one last masterwork, a game that didn't parody America but confronted it. A game that embraced national identity not to sell nostalgia but to interrogate it. I am, of course, talking about Red Dead Redemption 2. To say that Red Dead Redemption 2 is merely a game would be a gross understatement. It's a sprawling operatic experience that uses the American frontier not just as a backdrop, but as a living, breathing character in its own right. Unlike so many modern American titles, which sand off their cultural edges to appease what they believe to be globalized tastes or push vague platitudes, Red Dead Redemption 2 doubles down on its Americanness. Not the Marvel kind, but the complicated, contradictory kind. The kind soaked in blood, mud, hope, and hypocrisy. Now, Red Dead is a true Western game. To me, part of what makes it stand out so much is that it leans into American history rather than avoiding it. It doesn't pretend to be relatable to all cultures or watered down by committees. Instead, it drags players through the ugly, beautiful mess of a dying Wild West, where industrialization crushes frontier dreams and the myth of American exceptionalism unravels through the eyes of a doomed outlaw. This is the United States on the cusp of modernity, presented with a degree of nuance you simply don't get when focus groups or ESG reports are steering the wheel. Rockstar didn't shy away from the contradictions of American history, it wallows in them. You get racism, classism, religious hypocrisy, land theft, the rise of corporate interests, all themes that mirror not only America's past, but its present. And crucially, it doesn't insult your intelligence whilst doing so. You're trusted to make up your own mind about the Van der Linde gang and their choices, about the government agents and the Pinkertons, and about whether the so-called civilized world is any less savage than the one being left behind. The game isn't trying to sell you on America good or America bad. It's not a 2-star Netflix special. It's a slow, deliberate rumination on a nation losing its soul. In a gaming landscape increasingly sterilized by corporate mandates, Red Dead Redemption 2 is proof that letting a game be culturally American, warts and all, can result in something profound rather than problematic. And that only makes the contrast sharper when you look at how other global powers approach game development. Because while American studios often struggle to express their own culture authentically, countries like China are taking a very different path. Not through creative vision, but through strategic investment and control. Both Tencent and NetEase have aggressively expanded into Western and Japanese gaming over the past decade, but the nature of that involvement looks very different from the influence exerted by American publishers. Tencent, for example, owns Riot Games outright and holds substantial stakes in Epic Games, Activision, Blizzard, Frontier Developments, and even From Software. NetEase, meanwhile, has fully acquired Quantic Dream and Grasshopper Manufacture and has also launched its own Western publishing arm, staffed with industry veterans like Jack Emmett, best known for his work on superhero MMOs such as City of Heroes, City of Villains, and Champions Online during his time as CEO of Cryptic Studios. Yet, despite this deep financial involvement, the Chinese firms have generally taken a hands-off approach to creative direction. In most cases, they allow studios to retain operational autonomy and avoid imposing specific political or ideological narratives. Their influence is strategic and market-driven, not cultural. These companies want returns on their investments, but they typically don't interfere with how those games are written, structured, or marketed, at least not outside China. This is in sharp contrast to the model increasingly seen from US firms, where funding often comes with strings attached, compliance with DEI targets, ideological vetting, or content filtered through a specific socio-political lens. It's not just about turning a profit, it's about shaping the medium to reflect a set of corporate-aligned values. So while Chinese investment is frequently met with concern in media discourse, its actual impact on Western game development has, so far, been less disruptive than that of the American entertainment industrial complex. That's because the real pressure isn't always about ownership, it's about how the money works. And in the case of US-driven gaming, the money almost always comes with conditions. In terms of games developed in China by Chinese companies, Black Myth Wukong's distinctly Chinese identity has been one of its greatest strengths, setting it apart. By drawing from the rich mythology of Journey to the West, the game offers a fresh visual and narrative language that feels both exotic and authentic to international audiences. This cultural specificity not only piqued curiosity but also showcased China's capability to produce high-caliber original titles that aren't derivative of existing global trends. In a gaming landscape often criticised for its creative stagnation, Wukong stood out by embracing its roots rather than mimicking established formulas. This approach resonated with players worldwide, propelled the game to sell over 25 million copies globally since its August 2024 launch. The developers leaned hard into the culture they knew and then reaped the rewards. It's tempting to think that the changes we see in Western gaming design are simply the result of shifting creative tastes, but more often, they're driven by external financial and political pressures, especially from investors and corporate consultants. Many large studios now operate under the influence of ESG scoring, environmental, social and governance policies used to assess the social responsibility of a company. These scores affect the access to funding, partnerships and even platform visibility. In theory, this is meant to promote ethical business practices. In reality, though, it's often a checklist imposed by third-party consultancy firms that prioritises optics over output. This has led to game narratives being filtered through layers of HR compliance, external consultancy and image management. Several developers have anonymously reported having their scripts, character designs and even gameplay mechanics altered or vetoed based on whether they met ESG or DEI targets. In these environments, creative leads are no longer answering to an audience or even to their own vision. They're answering to risk-averse boards, ESG advisors and PR teams. This isn't about blaming diversity itself, it's about recognising how it's being used. These standards aren't empowering artists, they're often handcuffing them to a narrow set of acceptable themes and aesthetics. The end result is games that feel curated, not created. Which brings us back to the bigger picture. When people talk about the decline of Western gaming, what they're often describing, without realising it, is the decline of American-led gaming. The failures we've explored throughout this video are not the result of some inherent flaw in Western creativity, but of a particular corporate and ideological framework exported directly from the United States. Again and again, we've seen games pulled apart by shareholder expectations, HR-driven content guidelines, ESG scoring systems, and a fixation on live service models that prioritise engagement metrics over player enjoyment. This isn't Western gaming at large, it's an American media machine grafted onto global development pipelines. Meanwhile, studios in Europe, Japan and even China and South Korea continue to demonstrate that good games are still being made when developers are left to focus on gameplay, creativity and player experience, rather than on producing culturally sanitised, investor-optimised content that lacks any clear national identity. The tragedy is that many of the developers caught up in this system are talented, but talent doesn't thrive in environments dominated by external compliance metrics and vague ideological standards. It thrives in spaces where the priority is making something good and trusting the audience to respond. So next time a major title disappoints or a studio collapse is blamed on Western games, take a closer look. Because more often than not, the failure didn't come from the West as a whole, it came from one very specific corner of it. One that just happens to have a disproportionately loud voice, a lot of money, and a habit of making its problems everyone else's on the planet. So, how do we fix American gaming and its toxic influence over the rest of the world? Well, the answer isn't complicated, it just isn't convenient. Publishers need to stop managing developers like content farms. Investors need to stop measuring success by daily active users and social media impressions. And most importantly, developers need to be allowed to make the games they actually want to make, not what a branding consultant thinks will trend on TikTok. Good games don't come from compliance checklists or engagement funnels. They come from trust between creators and players. And that's what we've lost. That's what we have to get back. Don't forget you can get a ludicrous 40% off Expedition 33, or if a newly released fighting game is your thing, how about 30% off the amazing Fatal Fury City of the Wolves? Get up to 90% off thousands of modern, AAA, classic and retro titles too. Or, if you want to support my work in a more personal way, you can unlock my behind-the-scenes cosplay library and more by becoming a backer over on Patreon.